Purple and yellow. Mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Orange. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Red sand. Mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Chocolate. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Grape. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Oops. Wow. Orchid. Green and purple. Mixing, mixing. Mixing. Mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Indigo. Mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Grape. Mixing, mixing. 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 Wow. Gray. Mixing, mixing. 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 Wow. Parrot. Mixing, mixing. 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 Wow. Lime. Red and white. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Wow. Blush pink. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Oops. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Fiery rose. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing, 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 mixing. Wow. Strawberry. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing, 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 mixing. Wow. Mango. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Wow. Rose. Green and white. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Wow. Pastel. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Mint. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Clover. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Wow. Pine. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Wow. Lawn. Blue and pink. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Wow. Orchid. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Wow. Majorelle blue. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing, 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 mixing. Wow. Royal blue. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Capri blue. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Wow. Azure blue. Yellow, orange and brown. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Melon. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Apricot. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Holland tulip. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Butterscotch. Mixing, mixing. Wow. Furry lion. Purple and sky. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Azure blue. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing, 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 mixing. Wow. Capri blue. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Oops. Wow. Neon blue. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing, 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 mixing. Wow. Royal blue. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing, 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 mixing. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Wow. Berry. Yellow and green. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Pear. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing, 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 mixing. Wow. Avocado. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Oops. Wow. Mustard. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Saffron. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Wow. Goldenrod. Yellow and brown. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Chocolate. Mixing, mixing. 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 Wow. Peach. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Melon. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Wow. Pastel. Brown and pink. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing, 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 mixing. Mixing. Wow. Baby pink. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing, 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 mixing. Wow. Light pink. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Salmon. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Mixing. Wow. Peach. Mixing, mixing, mixing. Wow. Chestnut.